I'm Elizabeth McDonald, co-chair of the East Central Ontario Regional Council's Affirming Forum. And with me, Michiko Bonkai, ordained minister serving a congregation in Cambridge, Ontario, Wild Ferris, a doctoral student at Queen's in Kingston. And we're here to talk about the region of East Central Ontario becoming a fully affirming region. Now, in 2019, when the regions were established, East Central Ontario was granted an interim affirming status on the basis that Bay of Quinte Conference and Toronto Conference had both been affirming conferences. Now, Michiko, you spent your young adult years here in East Central Ontario. You were very active in conference activities, and you've been involved in Affirm United, S'enfermer Ensemble. I'm wondering, from your experience in and out of this region, and from your perspective, why is it important that this region become fully affirming?
There are so many ways that I could answer this question because I think there are so many good reasons to consider, and so much of what I struggle to put into words is just how many stories there are about people's relationship with church when it comes to these questions around belonging, inclusion, and gender identity and sexual orientation. But I think very plainly, I can just say that it saves lives to do this kind of work. The truth is, we live in a world where there are many people who feel so strongly that they need a safe space to explore their spirituality, to belong to church as LGBTQ2S people. And from all of the ministry experiences I've had in the past decade, there are just so many instances, time and time again. It's surprising how often people are just taken aback and totally surprised yet thrilled to know there are actually queer ministers out there, that there are churches that are affirming. This is still groundbreaking work, sad but true. And I think for me, from a theological perspective, I think that there's just something wonderfully queer about the disruptive and liberative nature of the Holy Spirit. And in that way, I think the question isn't just, should we become affirming, but do you, as a church, want to be a part of what God is up to in the world? And I guess the last thing I would add is just the personal anecdote of my own experiences, which is that as a questioning queer youth, if I hadn't had a space where I felt like I could be openly queer, openly non-binary, I don't know if I would have ever found my way back into the church. And so I think it's just important to realize what doors you are opening when you decide to do this kind of work.
Now, Wild, you have grown up in the church, but your early years were spent in a different denomination. And it was when you were a young adult that you and your family made the decision to come into the United Church of Canada. You live here in the region. And over the past year, you've worked with us on the Affirming Forum. You're involved in the equity team. From your experience in and out of this denomination, from your perspective, why is it important the region be affirming?
Yeah, I, as someone who grew up in a different denomination, in a more evangelical denomination, it was extremely difficult to come out to my church community. I had been incredibly active in my teenage years in the church. I was on the worship team, I was in nursery, and when I came out, all of that was suddenly not something that I was allowed to do anymore because my particular lifestyle was not supported. And I am still, that was a good 5 or 6 years ago, I'm still unpacking the harm and the hurt that event caused me, because it really impacted my connection in my spirituality as a whole. It really kind of forced me out of my walk of faith and put me in an entirely different position where I no longer felt welcome in a community of faith whatsoever. And if I was going to ever kind of enter into a place of faith, I had to put up these walls around me that I took for a very long time to even start to unbuild. It wasn't until actually this year in particular that I started to feel that community again, working with the Affirming Forum and working on the equity team and working in the United Church, and truly starting to understand as a denomination that the United Church was accepting of who I was no matter what. That I really started to allow myself to make those social connections again and make those connections and open myself up to a different faith perspective again, that I was able to start to kind of reform connections in that same kind of way. I genuinely, I was not fully aware of the fact that every single time I walked into a church, all of my muscles would tense up and I would become uncomfortable and on guard and never fully able to actually connect in a spiritual way because I was so aware of the fact that I was not safe. And it's only been through forming these connections and knowing that I am in a safe place and that I am protected, have I been able to start to unbuild that and start to reconnect and start to build those connections again. And it's it's wonderful. It feels amazing, frankly.
Well, looking ahead, is there any concrete or particular initiative or action that would demonstrate to you that yes, East Central Ontario is living into being fully affirming? Anything in particular you'd like to see?
I think that having a actual stipulation in the concrete makeup of the region is very important, because even if one particular community of faith is not safe, because that happens, people have different opinions around there, and sometimes it can be hard to find those safe spaces. But even if that kind of concrete guideline is built into the infrastructure, it's the beginning of permanent change. And it's the beginning of support and this kind of foundational level of support of, even if these people are doing wrong to you, we as a denomination and we as a structured community support you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah. And Michiko, will there be anything that you're looking for to see is East Central Ontario taking seriously this commitment? Is it really living into being affirming? Anything particular you'll be looking for in the months and years ahead?
For me, it's exciting to see the regions as new ministries take on this work, because it's really an opportunity to say, who are we as a community? What matters? What are we going to prioritize? And to have the affirming lens as part of that work of, coming together. This is a perfect time. I mean, any time is always a good time to do this work, but yeah, I really hope to see the ways that the United Church can start to show up and develop more relationships and partnerships with LGBTQ and Two-Spirit communities and organizations, and see the relationships growing that way. And I think to take leadership in helping ministers and community leaders in supporting communities of faith. As someone that's in ministry right now, in the middle of this pandemic, but even beforehand, it can be really hard to know where to start or to know where to get the resources. And it makes such a big difference when there are other people like program staff that are developing the resources and helping people animate them on the ground. So I think that kind of support will be really important.
Now, the region's annual meeting is set for the first weekend in June, and one of the big decisions on the agenda, lay and clergy delegates will be voting to make this region fully affirming. Do you have anything you want to say to those delegates? Anything you want them to keep in mind? Anybody you want them to hold in their hearts as they prepare to vote and make this decision to become fully affirming?
I think for me, to keep in mind that the boundaries or walls that people may have drawn around who this is about and who it's not are not necessarily always there. You know, you might think that you're voting on someone else's behalf only to realize that it's your loved one or your family member that's coming out a little while later, and you're going to really wish that your community of faith could support you through that journey of figuring that out. Yeah, you never know actually like who you're in relationship with and what that means. I think about being part of Big Windy Conference Youth Forum and the youth that would show up and say, and you know, see the ways that I expressed being an affirming leader, and then come out to me and then say, this is the first time I've been able to come out. You know, to think about the people that are, you know, going to be able to have a positive experience of coming out in a community of faith or a church space, and just how big of a gift that could be.
Thanks. Bye.
Yeah, I want to say I really strongly agree with what Michiko said. You really never know who is listening or who's around and what impact that could have on that particular person. I also really want to push that it's going to be a little bit uncomfortable. There are growing pains and they're real, but the impact of that bit of uncomfortness and that bit of learning is going to be minimal in the face of the effect and the greater good that is going to happen from it. Like there are, like Michiko said at the beginning, this is a life-saving act. There are many, many people who have and continue to struggle with very difficult life-altering decisions because of rejections from communities of faith. And by determining and becoming a fully affirming community, that's huge, and that will ultimately save lives. And I think that's really important to remember.
This conversation is far from over. There's a long way to go on this journey, but let me thank you both so very much. Wild, Michiko, thank you for being part of this conversation right now as all of us in the region of East Central Ontario move toward become fully affirming. Thank you.
Thank you.